I'm delighted to be joined in this conversation with my panel of experts, and I will now introduce them one by one. Professor Jennifer Adair, who is a professor in Translational Science and Therapeutics Division and Cell and Gene Therapy Program in the US at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. And her laboratory has developed a number of the tools that are now integrated into delivering gene therapy to the patients who need them anywhere in the world. She also co-founded the Global Gene Therapy Initiative, which she shares with Dr. Sisikitio Mutuluza, and that is an initiative that she has led since 2020. So in a minute, we will hear from Jen about both her research and how gene therapy actually works, and what the initiative that you've set up can do. To my left is Mr. Jimmy O'Lahair, who is actually a patient who's benefited from gene therapy using CRISPR-Cas technology and had a transformative experience in many ways. And we're really grateful to have you here and tell us about the journey also of someone who has actually benefited from the therapy and who's gone through the ups and downs of how that might have looked. To my right, opposite is Dr. Anna Hurries, who is a medical doctor by training, but who spent the last 10 years in biotechnology development, who has been an investor and a founder of many inventive approaches to also bringing these new therapies to people in terms of the investment. You've been the CEO of Neovax and OsseImmuno. You have founded 5 biotech companies, and you joined a firm called Advent in 2012. Your medical and biotechnical background gives you a unique perspective, and you're interested in the global conditions and how we really expand this access. And I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from a couple of examples that you can also bring to the table. And last but not least, Professor Christoph von Kalle, who is a colleague of ours at the Berlin Institute of Health. You are leading clinical translational science, and you are the founding director of the joint BIH Charité Clinical Study Center that we've had since 2019. You are a very established scientist, and you're also an entrepreneur. So again, you have a clinical background in hematology oncology, which sets you up perfectly for the field, and you're a member of the Advisory Council on the Assessment of Developments in the Healthcare Sector. Most importantly, you've also led the German strategy for development of cell-based and gene therapy that is currently under discussion. So I welcome you all here. Welcome to the audience, and I would like to kick off with a question to Jennifer, because we need to get back to some sort of joint level of understanding what gene therapy and what these cell-based therapies are actually about, and how better than a scientist to explain it to us. Jen.
Thank you for that introduction, Beate. Genetic medicines are revolutionizing human health and treatment. We are now able to cure incurable diseases. This stems from centuries of understanding in basic biology of how our bodies work and how different insults in our environment impact that biology. Quickly, just to draw everyone in, can you please raise your hand if you received a Moderna or Pfizer COVID vaccine? You have all received a genetic medicine. That is how far this is revolutionizing treatment. But if I were sitting in a room in sub-Saharan Africa and I asked the same question, it's very likely that not a single hand would go up. And this is something that we're trying to talk about in this particular panel today. Jimmy's going to talk about sickle cell disease and how we think about not just how we get these medicines after they're developed, but how we think back to how we actually bring in access at the earliest stages of development in research. It's really academic institutions that the majority of these gene and cell medicines are coming out of, and that is who is empowered to change the paradigm of access, more so than relying on governments or companies after it has already been developed to do so.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the principles behind gene therapy, so people know It's not you're going to get something cut out or something put in? Or?
We can do all of those things.
Yes.
Basic biology of life is genetic information, DNA, turns into RNA, turns into protein, which runs the cells in our body and in the environment. Disease comes from either insults like bacteria or viral infections that can impact that biology, or from mistakes in our own DNA that we are either born with or that we acquire over our lifetime. And what we have learned is that we can manipulate this system to actually benefit human health. We can fix genes that are broken. We can program cells with new genes that they didn't have before that teach them to do new things. For example, immune cells, we can teach them to recognize cancer as if it were an infection from the environment. We can also treat viral infections like HIV. By understanding how HIV's biology interfaces with our biology, we can redesign the genetics of our cells to actually prevent HIV from not only replicating but infecting other individuals.
Thanks, Jen. So to put that into a practical context, Jimmy, you suffered from, or you were born with, a condition called sickle cell disease, which is a change in the way that your red blood cells were made, right? And that gave you really an awful time in your childhood. And then this prospect of gene therapy came about. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, how it was before you had the gene therapy and how that changed your life?
Yeah, for sure. I'd like to say living with sickle cell disease was, walking on the edge of a cliff perpetually. I was always in fear of falling and getting some vaso-occlusive crisis. A crisis is severe pain that comes with sickle cell disease when red blood cells aren't moving around properly. And it spirals and it compounds, and it brings something in mind in regards to the endpoints. When these clinical trials are developed, it's usually around reducing the vaso-occlusive crisis, but many people forget that sickle cell is always working, even when you're not having a crisis. Your organs are completely in jeopardy. I've had my gallbladder taken out, I've almost lost my spleen, had cardiac arrest, pulmonary embolism, gone blind. All of these things just keep on adding and adding and adding. And there's also a very mental side to the disease as well, because it has a way of entrapping you in your own body, and you kind of watch life pass by, which can tend to be very difficult. So, you get in your feelings a lot living with sickle cell disease. So it is a whole mind, body disease that, for so long had been ignored. And not to talk about the stigma that, particularly living in the US with the disease, for me, there were many times that I was embarrassed of going to the emergency room because I was in fear of what doctors would think of me coming in asking for high-powered pain medication.
Yep.
So I was, at my wit's end, and fortunately I got really lucky. I had done some research in attempts to appease my parents, and found an article on someone called Victoria Gray, who was the first person to have her DNA or have a sickle cell alleviated through gene therapy. And, I reached out to the team, and I qualified for that clinical trial, and it changed my life. At one point in my life, I was bedridden, where I literally couldn't get out of bed. I was in bed from sun up to sundown, and last month or 2 months ago, I was able to summit Kilimanjaro through gene therapy.
Yeah, and your childhood, you missed lots of school. I would think you had lots and lots of painkillers. You had even a blood transfusion system where you had to go in every month or so having half your blood exchanged. And of course, your disease was really impacting on your quality of life big time, right?
Yeah.
So you're now really an advocate for patients and people who've undergone gene therapy and whose lives really changed quite a lot. So how's that worked in terms of the communication? Because as researchers, we also need the information, because gene therapy doesn't happen overnight. So tell us a little bit about the complexities, because I want people to not just think, it's all a quick fix, because it isn't a quick fix. And if you want to tell us a little bit about that journey part, it would be great as well.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, my gene therapy had 4 main stages. The first stage is something they call keeping you on ice, which means it's basically keeping you healthy for the clinical trial you're about to go through the journey. So blood transfusions, blood exchanges. You do that for a couple of weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe even a month. And the next stage is the collection phase, where they collect your stem cells. At the crack of dawn, your stem cells are mobilized with something called prolaxafor. You get that injection, and you actually feel the stem cells going through your blood cells.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can feel it. And they connect you to an apheresis machine, and that you sit on that for about 8 hours, and you can literally feel the electrocution. I think that's what's happening. I'm not sure. Jen can probably confirm that it's splitting your stem cells and the red blood cells, and you sit on this machine for 8 hours as it.
It's a bit like a dialysis machine,
It's
right?
exactly
I just
like
want
that.
people to think about what that might look like. Right?
Yeah, it's exactly like that. And you go through that process. Depending on your biology, you might get collected once, twice. I had to get collected 4 times. And then after the collection process, you go through the conditioning phase where you get conditioned, your body gets chemotherapy to make room for your new stem cells. And then finally, you get infused. Your cells are taken somewhere else, manufactured, edited, and they're brought back to you. For me, it was very anticlimactic because I'd done this collection process and I see them shipping big bags of blood out as soon as the collection was done. And then I was expecting big bags of blood to come back to get infused, and it was just 3 syringes, 3 tiny syringes, and I was kind of in shock. All that work for just 3 syringes, but that's the power of the technology. And I got infused with it, and I think it took about 2 weeks. I always have some type of lingering pain that
So
I don't.
you were in hospital
I
during
was in
all
hospital,
this time in
yeah.
an isolation room, also
Correct.
to keep you free from infections
Correct.
because you
My
just
white
had
blood
had the
cells were-
chemotherapy.
exactly.
And so you were literally making room for your modified cells to arrive back in your body, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I refused that. I received that infusion, and about 2 weeks later, I could tell it was working.
How did that feel?
Strange.
Yeah?
Yeah, it felt very strange because for me, I had used sickle cell as a chip on my shoulder for so long. I had used pain as a motivator. And one day I wake up and I didn't have pain anymore. So I was kind of lost and I had an identity crisis. Yeah, which was crazy because I'm in the middle of the pandemic, getting my life improved. I've just had my biggest challenge possibly solved, and I'm not happy. So that actually even put me into a further depression.
Right, but I'm glad you came out of that because 5 years later, you're a really well person, you're a parent, you're looking after 3 small children and your wife, and you've just climbed Kilimanjaro, so congrats to you.
Thank you.
I will ask you a few more questions about what we can learn, how we organize our trials in a little minute, but I want to go to maybe the aspects, who's heard of sickle cell disease in this room before? Hands up. Okay, great. So do you know that there's 7 million people living with this disease in the world, and that the mortality in children with sickle cell disease is 4 times as high as it is in children not with sickle cell disease? So not many people know that, I should say. So, it's kind of, you grew up in the US, and your family is from a part of the world where sickle cell disease is very, very common. So this is obviously something which is exceptional achievement also to be seen. And I know your inbox is full of people from Nigeria sending you emails saying, I want to do this too. So just talking to Alan about this, who is a person who's now thinking about and investing in technologies that are connected to what is quite an extensive process, to how do we get this to these 7 million people out there? Will we, what do we need? What is the idea of investors as well? Because there's clearly a huge market there. And nobody does anything if there isn't a market. But with sickle cell disease, for sure, there's a market. So I'd love to hear a bit from your experience.
Yes, I think the question is very important. When you think about, let's say, sophisticated technology like cell gene therapy, definitely today, the manufacturing process, the cost of goods to generate those technologies and therapeutics remain very expensive. So the question for investor and industrial partners is really to find ways to reduce the cost of manufacturing, to simplify the manufacturing, to even allow local access to those technologies. So our fund invests in innovation, therapeutic innovation, but we do not only invest in therapeutic innovation, but we also invest in technology enabling platform, supporting new therapeutics. Because we believe that if, CAR T cell treatment cost 150,000 euro to produce, this will be limited to maybe less than 10% of eligible patients. So clearly, we have made several investments in this field. In cell therapy, for example, we invested in a company developing miniaturized microfluidic technology, automated technology, to reduce by 10 the cost of goods. So this is already a first step to, enlarge the access to patients, and indeed to attract new investors, new partners that will consider that the number of patients they can reach with cheaper technology can compensate what they will not gain. So the question that I have sometimes
supply and
is,
demand, right?
supply the demand. If you have high COGS, then you have an high price. Then the question is, if you have a very low COGS, then the margin should decrease. The margin should not stay, the price should not stay at the level that we know today. So this is for us the basis of a broader diffusion of the technology to patients. So indeed, we have the chance to be in Western countries where the social security system can afford to pay a certain price. But we have to think about, enlarging the access to patients worldwide. So it goes through technology transfer, it goes to improving the cost of manufacturing, but also to find some alternative solution. I founded one company about 15 years ago, producing through plant roots, now producing AAV, so new vector. And this is a very cheap, climate impact friendly, and that can definitely reduce also the cost of viral vector. So I think for me, innovation, treating patients with unmet medical need is very important. Addressing rare disease, orphan population is also very important. This is one of our mission in AdBio. But also investing in new innovative technology enabling platform to, increase the diffusion of those technologies.
I'll come back to Jen in a minute because she's leading an initiative that should also be promoting what you've just suggested. Christoph, Germany is a resource-rich country, and you're in charge of defining the strategy with the stakeholders for how we actually give access, at least on a national basis. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about how you've negotiated this space on a national perspective, but also if there's an international and an equity perspective in the German strategy.
Yeah, we haven't thought this one up. We coordinated a process with all stakeholders. I think there are certain strengths in this area in Germany, namely the basics, science research in many of the diseases and the virology, some of the vector developments. Our weaknesses clearly are more in the translational step of getting it into the clinic, and also the investment space. Basically, our early investor risk investors are much more into engineering and machinery in Germany as in biology. So actually the German Parliament has tasked us with the coordination of an all-stakeholder attempt to define a strategy, a national, or if you wish, pro-European strategy of developing these resources and putting the smaller laboratories and smaller projects together, basically mapping out who is there, what is available, and what is the greatest needs, and then trying to define that. And that's been a very interesting process. Took a little while for people to find buy-in, but eventually everybody contributed, both industry and academia, what is needed. And that's actually what we identified. And there are a lot of laboratories who can produce at the clinical trial stage. We have certainly a good science there, but then the step of bringing this up to the level of a clinical trial, that's where we need to, I think, place a stronger push.
Right. And does the thinking in Germany just restrict itself to the patients that we'll be seeing in Germany, or is there also a thought about technology transfer and the bigger space? Because, I mean, just in Berlin here, we have one of the largest sickle cell clinics in the country, for sure.
No, not at all. These are way too complex to even do them at the national level. We have, I think, excellent experience in the last 15 years or so with the European funding into gene therapy projects. My own lab, as well as many other labs, have contributed to a number of the European trials, the ADA trial, the European sickle cell trials, the ALD, just to name a few. And so these are much too complex for any single institution, or I think in a lot of sense, even single countries to run them. So this is certainly, an open approach. But of course, then we think about, from our perspective, our responsibility and our budget, what can we contribute to, if you wish, the international community of getting this on the road.
Right, great. Well, Jen, you lead the Global Gene Therapy Initiative. Maybe give us a little bit of a snapshot of what that actually is, why you set it up, who's part of it. Yeah.
Yes, so we're actually a digital network. It is represented by every stakeholder, from patients and families all the way to commercial developers, policymakers, regulators, investors, and scientists and clinicians. We are over 200 members now, representing over 36 countries on 6 continents. But it arose out of actually a failure. Between 2008 and 2012, I was in Seattle, and my job as a translational researcher was to take new gene therapies that had been developed in the laboratory and convert them into the first in-human clinical trials. And we were doing that really well. I was sort of living my highest life as a researcher, publishing 10 papers a year, bringing things to patients in the clinic. And all of those were for pretty rare diseases. And then in 2012, I was asked to translate a phase 1 clinical trial for patients with cancer who were also HIV positive. And the goal was to not only treat their cancer, but also to potentially cure them of their HIV infection. And to be honest, I didn't know much about HIV, except that we had repurposed some of its recipe to actually perform gene therapy. I went to a conference to learn more about the biology of HIV, and on day 1, the very first slide that was put up was the global prevalence. This is not a rare disease or an ultra-rare disease. 40 million people, almost 2 million new infections just last year, and the vast majority of those newly infected, including children, live in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, which in 2012, there were no gene therapy trials, and today, in most of sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, who just treated their first patient in the last month, there were no gene therapy trials. And I did something very naive. I thought, I know how to solve this. I'm doing this right now. I'm just going to build a device that can automate this so that they don't have to build the giant multi-million-dollar infrastructure that we're blessed to have in the US, and that's going to solve it. And we did that. We published our paper in 2016. It was great. It was actually in collaboration with a German company, Miltenyi Biotech. And that was awesome. And then a bunch of countries reached out and said, how can we do this? And then we started going to those countries, and I very quickly realized that I was incredibly naive to think that it was going to be that simple. There are so many facets to this complex issue. We have to treat humans like humans. We have to understand the culture from which they come. We have to understand how they want to be treated, what they're looking for in treatment, all of these things that we hadn't addressed. And so I started a journey in 2016, 2017 to think about how we could manage solving some of those problems, knowing now that by myself it wouldn't be enough. I started inviting researchers who were interested in gene therapy from many low and middle income countries to the US and to Europe to attend our gene therapy conferences, and got hit by the first major barrier, which is geopolitical. It often takes months just to get a visa appointment, sometimes years to get a visa. If they can't be in the room with us and we don't offer virtual opportunities, it's going to be a very long time before we allow people the opportunity to catch up or to be part of the conversation. And in 2019, in collaboration with Dr. Sisikitsho Mutuluza, who is the first gene therapy researcher and physician in Uganda, we had an idea to spin out a virtual platform that just connected people. Essentially, once a week, we host a digital meeting on Zoom. It's very low budget. We just pay for data packages for those whose internet service is unstable, and we invite gene therapy experts and stakeholders from all spaces, including patients like Jimmy, just to talk about their experience, to talk about the research they're doing. And by bringing everyone into the same conversation, we start to really address the problems of scale and access in ways that we haven't before. And in 2019, when I proposed this, the family that was thinking about funding it, that I pitched it to, said, "There's no way you're going to get that many people around the world on a digital platform." But they funded us anyway in January of 2020. And 3 months later, they said, "How did you know?" This was going to happen to everyone anyway. And 5 years later, almost 5 years later now, we have the first gene therapies happening in South Africa. India can make CAR T-cell cancer gene therapy for $35,000 a product, and they think they can get it down to 15. And Uganda will be starting their first gene therapy trial to treat hemophilia A in January of 2025.
Wow.
It just shows scientists also need to be advocates and things can move.
I just want to say that's just by having people talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's all we do.
Yeah. Jimmy, going back to the whole setup of the experience of being in a clinical trial where you were, I think you were number 26 on the list to start with, and then because of COVID, some people couldn't make their slots and you moved up to number 4 and you were the 4th patient in the US actually who got this therapy. What could we as investigators do better to facilitate access or to, how, even you finding out about this was probably quite a journey. So just give us a little idea about how that journey worked and what we can do in terms of the clinical trial.
I think first of all, I think it was a shame that I had to, find out about a clinical trial like this through a publication, which was good that publication was out, but none of my hematologists ever presented this option to me. And when I actually found out about it, and the first thing they told me, the person I talked to was my hematologist, he was actually pushing me away from going through with this therapy. So I think that is probably the first place to address it, is making sure doctors, hematologists are willing to talk about these therapies to patients. Financially, I can see why it might be a difficult thing for them. But that's one of the reasons I became public with my story as well, that if I had to find out about this therapy through an article and my doctor was pushing me away from it, I bet there are other patients that are probably going to go through the same experience. So I think that's the first step. And with sickle cell disease in particular, I think the criteria is kind of off. Not many people understand how the disease works, particularly if you don't live with it. Most of us, we treat our crises at home. We don't go to emergency room. The clinical trial I participated in, one of the criteria was you need to have gone to the emergency room, I think twice or 3 times a year, or I think it's a month. But there are many patients, because of the stigma I spoke of, that are willing to treat their treat their sickle cell crises at home. So that excludes a swath of patients that this trial could potentially save their lives. So I think that's another thing we need to really work on, is the eligibility criteria. And of course, finally, is access. After I had come out of my mental health issues post-transplant and was finally enjoying the full-blown effects of the therapy, when I found out it cost $2.3 million, it turned my joy into ashes in my mouth, basically, and that is actually what got me interested in continuing to champion this technology, particularly for regions that don't have access to it, because the world is a global village. Sickle cell, I feel like the epicenter is in Africa, and I think patients that have the disease are continuing to want to come to the West. And not to get too political and speaking about walls, I feel like what governments try to do is put up walls in order to stop patients from coming. Sickle cell disease is a good example of that. That's actually why my parents came to the US, because my mom didn't have access to newborn screening in Nigeria at the time. Right. So it's very, I think, beneficial for governments across the world, even though I think that the Africans really need to put their own effort into it, but they need to start treating these diseases for the whole global landscape right at the epicenter.
Yeah, and there are some initiatives, and I'm going to come back to Alan, because, especially through the experience with COVID, it was obvious that Africa needed to take, and you could name another continent where people needed to take more ownership of having the facilities and not just the infrastructure, but also the personnel and the capacity in their own countries, continents, etc. And a whole initiative by the African Union was created, which initially focused on the plan for action of vaccine manufacturing, because there was obviously a huge 96% of all vaccines used in Africa at the moment are coming from abroad. There are very few vaccine companies in Africa, and that's also an advanced technology. But gene therapy is a few levels higher. But there is a commitment now also from the African Union, which is sort of delegated through the African countries in the regions, to do something about enabling the continent to produce not only its own vaccines, but also diagnostics and therapies. And we're talking about the therapy here. So Alan, how has that panned out in the way you see the movement go? Is that a help, or does it put a huge amount of expectations now? And do investors feel empowered by the fact that potentially there's a much bigger market? Because, obviously this needs to be done in collaboration. This doesn't come from just wanting to do it.
Yeah. So let's say that as an investor, first thing, our job is to invest in innovation, in new technologies, with the ultimate goal to give access to therapeutic innovation, to give the patients access to therapeutic innovation. And as a fund, I have fund of funds investing in our funds, and they expect somehow a return on their investment. So the return comes from our ability to generate high-value proposition that can be interesting for other investors or other partners, such as pharmaceutical companies. I mean, we all know that the pharma companies have, many drugs moving into the public domain in the next 2-3 years, so they need innovation. Now, what we have also observed is that some pharma companies have breakthrough innovation, but actually the way they manufacture them will limit their market. So their market size is very limited. Their revenue are very limited. And sometimes even they lose money every time they sell a treatment to a patient, simply because their cost of manufacturing are too high. So indeed, they are far away from thinking about expanding those innovations to many other countries, where they cannot even make any benefit that they can reinvest in innovation and research, where they cannot even make any benefit from their existing pipeline. So again, I think the solution comes through the way we can simplify the manufacturing of those high-level innovations. Now, we also invested in a company with on-site GMP unit for vaccine, which was also supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The idea being that this could be also used for maybe gene therapy local production. So the question is that we invest, we put the first brick in the innovation, in the transformation, because we are an early stage investor. So our job is really to transform the innovation, to make it as a product for patients, for an unmet medical need. But then the question again is how we can expand the market. And so when you discuss with some pharma players, they also think about volume, not only a limited number of patients, certain revenue in Western European countries, but also they think about volume, because if you allow them to produce in a much easier way their drug, then they can expand their market and still generate revenue. So this is where, you know, we are working on let's say a small path to find a way where everyone is comfortable and can also benefit from maybe some grants, subvention that some countries can give, some philanthropic foundation where additional patients can benefit from the treatments. So I think it's a mix. There are many players around that, not only investor. I mean, we are here to transform the innovation. Pharma, which is there to invest in R&D, make profit, and reinvest in R&D. But also the way we can bring this solution in enabling platform that can even expand their market, their volume, and maybe working on then the price of those technologies. So I think it's a mix.
It has to be a win-win for
it has to
one
be a
party
win-win.
at the end, otherwise nothing ever works. It's an ecosystem, but there are examples of this. This is what happened with advanced market commitments, for example, in the vaccine space. I'm not at all saying it's as easy to make a gene therapy. I'm not saying making vaccines is easy, but there are many more patients.
Yeah.
In terms of research investment, do you think more needs to be done so we don't just end up with a monopoly of maybe one technology, maybe the two of you, that will then determine the price? Do you see a way that as researchers we can also kind of try and negotiate that space, and as people who are formulating a country strategy? Christoph.
Yeah, well, if I look at that discussion, there's this saying that to arrive first you have to arrive. So I think a lot of these technologies, they have treated successfully sickle cell disease for the very first time. Yeah. And of course, these are exceedingly expensive. May I remind you of the sequencing of the human genome, right? That the first one cost $1 billion. Yeah. We can now have it for less than $1,000. Or if you consider the COVID vaccine that you mentioned, a shot is in the two-digit euro or dollar space. It costs less than 100, right? And if you wish, it's a gene product. It's a certain form of gene therapy, a very simple one, albeit. But so I think you have to first, look at the content and just create the possibility at all, and then, like you pointed out, I think trying and devise simpler ways of doing this. Do we really need a CAR T-cell therapy, or do we eventually just need the 2 receptors to activate the patient's own immune cells? Can we do it in sort of a vaccine or even a tablet, protein type of therapy eventually, right? I think you should have people talking, but then eventually the solution is going to be biological. It's going to be science. It's my conviction.
Great point. The audience can start thinking about your questions, please, because we've got about 10 minutes to go. Jen, from the investment point for the research funding, do you think there is scope for more or different ideas? I mean, to downscale or to look at these alternatives, it means that you not actually stop at the way things are developed now, but there needs to be a drive that is also enhancing other platforms, maybe cheaper technologies. I mean, the Indians, I don't know how they can do it for 35,000 if it costs us 10 times as much. So there's got to be a translation step there. So how do you see that space?
Yeah, I think definitely, India is a unique case. They have high spending capacity, low workforce costs, but they will tell you that the major driver of cost in that is $35,107 a product. And the major cost driver is import of cost of goods, so goods that have to come from the US and Europe.
Right.
They're going to try and engineer and produce those locally at a much cheaper cost, which is how they think they can get to 15,000. The interesting thing about these genetic therapies is, again, they rely on the human genome, and the reality is that human genome sequencing has taught us that we are 99.9% all the same person. Our DNA is very similar. It doesn't care what country you live in. We are one global village, one global community. And we all unequivocally originated on the African continent as a human species. That's just the fact of the matter. The DNA doesn't lie. And so when we think about a genetic therapy and developing it in the best way possible that makes it most useful to the rest of the world, it makes biological sense to do that in the ancestral DNA population, not the most discreetly, most recently evolved genetic background. We do have to be mindful of cultural components of this. There has been manipulation and slavery and lots of things in our history that we cannot forget about. But the reality is we also have large populations of immigration. I learned at dinner last night that sickle cell hemoglobinopathies actually are the highest newly diagnosed genetic disease here in Berlin, and that is because of immigration. And so we have now global movement that gives us the possibility of working together in our own communities to kind of bring some of this about. But we're also sitting in a unique place in terms of the investment market in the US. When Casgevy, the sickle cell that Jimmy was treated with, and Lyfgenia, a competing gene therapy for sickle cell disease, went towards authorization from the FDA, there were at least 4 other gene therapies in development that had clinical data supporting safety and efficacy that were withdrawn. Yeah. They were just abandoned because there's no longer a market case. But that means that there are tools that have shown to be safe and efficacious dying on a shelf or in a freezer somewhere that could have easily been transferred and allowed or permitted to be evaluated in other populations.
Sure.
That are still, unfortunately, not there.
So competition is good for the market. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience. So are there any questions? I don't know how it works. Do people just raise their hands? Can't see at the back. Okay, well, if there are no questions, we'll just plow on. So, so maybe back to Jimmy. So how do we achieve that the literacy about opportunities that are there for patients like yourself are increased? Because obviously the communication isn't doing a good enough job, right? And yeah, give us some hints.
I think we need to invest in patient educational materials. That's one of the biggest things right now. A lot of patients still are not understanding what gene therapy is. We need to demystify that and show them that these therapies can actually improve their lives. Another important thing that we need to, particularly in the US, is our healthcare system. I think it's severely broken. I think new technologies deserve novel business model. I've been learning from Jen a lot about these value-based pricing that we're so used to in the US. I don't think it's going to work for gene therapies. I read something the other day about how in Brazil, healthcare is basically a right. And if there's an approved therapy on the market in Brazil and the government doesn't give a patient access to it, they have the ability to sue the government and potentially win for that therapy. So Brazil is coming up with novel ideas of creating gene therapy, their own versions of gene therapy, significantly cheaper, as it will protect them from being sued. So I think these technologies, these strategies need to be adopted in the US as well, because a lot of people are going to die. A lot of people are going to die with sickle cell disease, and the only way to get this therapy to them right now is first in the US fixing our healthcare system, and then figuring out a way to get these therapies accessible globally.
Yeah, I guess, the role that you're playing as an advocate for patients is an important part of improving that literacy, and maybe give us a couple of points of how you go about that, because you can't go out and talk to 7 million people, right?
No.
So Do you do it on social media? Do you speak to physicians actually saying, hey guys, you told me there was nothing you could do for me, but here I am.
Yeah.
You know.
I'll speak to anyone I can.
Yeah.
I speak to biotech firms. I speak to venture capitalists. I'm in Jen's fantastic GGTI group. My goal is to spread the message, one, by telling my story on how powerful this technology can be, and drawing that picture of look at how great this thing is, and then comparing that to how many people need it that don't have it. I don't know if it was on the outset of this call, we mentioned that the life expectancy of people that live with sickle cell disease on the African continent is 5 years old.
Right.
Usually the way they're diagnosed is first they get a stroke at the age of 2, and they can't recover from that stroke at 5. So what I do is I try to spread the message. I try to find ways to bridge that gap while we're waiting for gene therapies to become accessible. This Kilimanjaro trek I did a month ago, one of the initiatives was raising money to buy newborn screening and hydroxyurea for people that live in that region. And I think that's a way to keep patients alive until gene therapies become popular or accessible. Newborn screening is still not affordable in parts of Africa. A lot of patients still don't know what hydroxyurea is.
Sure.
So as we're building gene therapy, I think we need other options for patients that have this condition.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important because it's not going to transform overnight, but there are therapies possibly available, or at least, symptoms can be milder if you have certain therapies, and that should also be an access right, as you're just saying. Health should be a right and not a political football. Do you think that the scope of a much enlarged market would really galvanize this innovation coming forward? Because ultimately the argument is going to be economical, right? And a question of prioritization as well. So who do we speak to? Is it the ministers of health, or is it the ministers of finance, or is it the health insurance? Who are the people to make the point to?
Yeah, I think Ministry of Health, definitely. Knowing that the healthcare has an important economic component in any country, both on the GDP that it generates itself, but also on the patient care and the better quality of life, and the patient that can be in the overall economy and
be productive. I mean, you can calculate it in dollars. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think expanding markets. I mean, I'm a strong believer. I mean, I did this my career on the patient care and treating patients. So I mean, it's a continuity in a mission. So the question is obviously. So if I take the example of France, we have some patient access cohort scheme, which can even help accessing new innovative treatment even before approval.
I'm just noticing I'm doing a bad job with the timekeeping, because I have to all ask you.
That's right.
For the 30 seconds, your last comment on what is the next step we have to break down the wall to expand global access to innovative medical therapies. I think you were just giving us an example.
Yeah, miniaturization,
right.
Microfluidic simplification of manufacturing.
Very clear. Jane?
We need to stop developing therapies in a silo and remember that we need to use the global standard case for a disease from the beginning, and the clinical metrics for the average patient on the globe with that disease when we're developing the clinical trial and the access plan for that gene therapy.
It's all about translational science, I think.
Jimmy, what's your wish?
I'm going to go a separate way. I think people with sickle cell disease are going to start living longer because of gene therapy. Until we start germline editing, sickle cell disease patients are going to live longer, and we're going to have more children. I think we need more options. I don't want us to use advanced therapies as like gene therapy and build a wall and make that standard of care. Yeah. There are going to be multiple people with sickle cell disease that need other methods of treatment.
Great. Well, thanks very much to all four of you trying to break down a few of these walls, and thanks to the audience.